One of the major risk factors for coronary artery disease and acute coronary syndromes is dyslipidemia. So if you break down that word, we've got or like dysfunction or problem with lipidemia in the blood. Okay, so let's talk about where those lipids are, what they are, and what they're used for in the body, because there's a reason that they're there, right? So first of all, your body creates cholesterol in your liver. This cholesterol is kind of a fat-like substance that's used in the creation and stabilization of cell membranes. It's used for a couple other things, but let's just focus on that for our purposes. We need cholesterol. It has such a bad rap. You hear the word cholesterol and you think bad, right? But that cholesterol is actually needed to support the cell membranes and cell function, right? We need cellular membranes to separate organelles from everything else. And so the liver actually creates all of the cholesterol that your body needs for those purposes. Anything that you eat, any dietary cholesterol that is is in your body is superfluous. It's extra. It's not necessary. Okay. And so cholesterol, if you think of cholesterol like a fat, then you know that like oil and water, how they react to each other, right? So I just kind of think of it like that and remember that cholesterol, if you look here, that's kind of represented in these green dots, can't travel from the liver to where it needs to be in the blood system because it's a fat, right? And so in order for the body to move it around, the cholesterol is broken up into pieces, into these, kind of cellular proteins and lipoproteins and what have you, which is, so part of that is your low density and your high density lipoproteins, or your LDL and HDL. There's some other things too. But basically it breaks that cholesterol up into things that can travel in the blood, so that those proteins, those lipoproteins, can then go to where they are needed. Now, basically those lipoproteins, and you've got your low density and high density, right, move the cholesterol and other fats throughout the body. The low density lipoprotein is then carried back to the liver by the high density lipoprotein, where it's either used again to create more lipoprotein to bring back to the site where it's needed, or it's converted into bile acid and excreted. Okay, so your body needs high density lipoprotein in order to rid the body of low density lipoprotein. I just want you to ignore these dots here. I'm sorry, but they're opposite. So if you look at this kind of little drawing that I have here, if you have a lot of LDL, right, that needs to go back to the liver, and not as much HDL, what happens is this HDL will pair with this, let's just say, okay, it pairs with this one pairs with this one pairs with this one. You can see how very, very quickly you're going to end up with a buildup of this low density lipoprotein. And that's why this relationship between high density and low density is so, so important. Remember when we were talking up here about how the endothelial injury causes the body to release these free radicals that then oxidize those LDLs. And I said, we'll talk later about where those LDLs have come from. And this is why that buildup of LDL is so important in that pathogenesis, because the more LDL you have here, the more LDL you have to be oxidized, then you have the more LDL you have to be engulfed by the macrophages to form foam cells. And then, as we talked about earlier, those foam cells are really what starts that fatty streak, or the first phase of atherosclerosis. So the more LDL we have, just floating around in our blood vessels, in our system, that doesn't have HDL to take it back to the liver, the more chance we have, of it being oxidized and then used basically to create foam cells. If you have a hard time remembering, which of these is good and which is bad, most people usually will just remember that high starts with H and happy starts with H. So the high density, or HDL, is your happy lipoprotein, and low density is your bad one. And so basically that's why we want to have as much, it's okay to have LDL in our system. We just want to have an equal amount, or a relatively equal amount of high density lipoprotein as well, so that it can carry that low density lipoprotein back to the liver. Otherwise it builds up. So that's a pretty simple kind of breakdown of where it goes. There are a couple of so here, this is really your, the important thing to remember when we're talking about all of this is that those LDL are having high serum lipid levels. And again, when we say serum, we're talking about blood work, right? So when you have high lipid levels in your blood work, and here we're talking usually about LDL or VLDL, which we'll talk about, it's a major risk factor for coronary artery disease. Now, again, will you likely have to answer questions relating specifically to, the transport of LDL and HDL from to the liver, blah, blah, blah? Probably not. But because we went through that, I think if you have a question about whether or not it's going to be a risk factor, it'll be a no-brainer for you, because the pathogenesis, what's happening, right? So dyslipidemia, again, is an abnormal amount of lipids, and we'll talk about the different kinds of lipids in a minute, in your blood. This can also, so hypercholesterolemia, too much cholesterol and emia in the blood, or hyperlipidemia, which is too much lipid or lipid protein, lipoprotein, usually LDL, in the blood. Again, these are types of dyslipidemia, okay? Really, really quickly, while we're talking about blood work, these are numbers that you want to memorize. Cholesterol needs to be less than 5.2, I believe it's millimoles per liter. LDL needs to be less than 3.5, and HDL should be greater than 1. And again, we want the HDL to be high and the LDL to be low, so that, because we want the LDL to be able to make it back to the liver, to be basically to be dealt with there instead of building up in our blood. So these are definitely numbers you want to memorize for a test. And NCLEX, sure, you should know these for NCLEX. I find the NCLEX is a little bit more when you need to focus on blood work for the NCLEX, we're talking usually about electrolytes, glucose, things like that. But this is definitely a good thing to know. So when we're talking about lipids, again, this is something, so in the slides, for example, I see this slide right here, which is basically this little kind of tree that's showing you the different kinds of serum lipids, and that's it. There's no explanation. It's just kind of this tree. And I think the reason for that is not because your teacher's trying to trip you up. She's trying to give you as much information like what I'm trying to do, just giving you the background. Doesn't mean you have to memorize all of this. It's just good to have kind of an understanding. So let's go through these lipids with that understanding, that memorizing all of this is not necessary, but understanding it is, okay? So you have three different kinds of lipids in your body. You have cholesterol, which we just talked about, synthesized in the liver, is broken down in order to travel through the blood into very low density lipoproteins and high density lipoproteins. The very low then convert into low density proteins. This is a whole process we're not going to talk about today. But we just talked about cholesterol and the whole, the point of it and so on. So that's kind of like one of the three. We're going to skip triglycerides for a second because phospholipids is super easy. Phospholipids are the molecular structure of a phospholipid is basically a phosphate kind of head that you can see here with two tails of fatty acids. Again, not something you have to memorize, just giving you kind of a background, okay? This we know is used mostly to create the backbone of a cell membrane. If you remember from, grade 11 biology, what makes a cellular membrane is this bilayer of phospholipids. And if you look in here, I kind of added this little picture here. Don't get bogged down by all the other things in here. For right now, I just wanted to show you this kind of area here. It's this bilayer of phospholipids. This is what makes up your cell membrane, right? You've got the phosphate head and the fatty acid tail, and depending on whether they are attracted to water or hydrophobic, they sit this way, or which parts of them are hydrophobic. Anyway, I don't want to break all of that down for you. I just want you to kind of, all you need to understand is that it's basically the backbone of a cellular membrane is your phospholipids. So we need a good number of those in our body, right? And then we have these triglycerides. So a triglyceride is, I just don't want to. It's made up of a glycerol molecule and three fatty acids. So if you look at these little drawings, that's what I'm drawing here so that you can kind of, get it. That's a glycerol molecule right there. And the three things swinging off of it are three fatty acid chains. Okay. Again, you don't need to understand all of that. It's just background. Triglycerides, again, are synthesized in the liver. The body will convert any calories that you don't need into these triglycerides for future energy use. So triglycerides, not necessarily bad, right? This is what our body breaks down when we don't have food. When it doesn't have glucose, it doesn't have the nutrients it needs, it will break these down for energy. So what happens is they are the calories or the energy. Let's look at calorie as just energy. Is saved in fat cells or stored in fat cells as triglycerides, okay? And then triggered by glucagon for release. Don't worry about that. We'll talk about it when we talk about diabetes. But so that's basically what a triglyceride is, and a fatty acid. We don't necessarily need to break those down, but they're the things in the molecules that we need to break down to create energy. It's mostly carbon and hydrogen, right? And so there's two kinds of kind of fatty acids. You have saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. So if you look at, actually, I did put a little drawing in here. Again, don't panic. You don't need to have a list memorized. This is just the difference, just so you know, between a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid. This here, this long kind of molecular chain here, is actually that's your or your fatty acid chain. Don't worry about the little head here. So this is your fatty acid chain, and you can see it's the same all the way through. You've got a carbon, hydrogen at the end. Each carbon has two hydrogens attached, one at the top and one at the bottom. When your fatty acid chain looks like this, it's saturated, and I'll explain why in a second. Unsaturated fatty acid. And remember, there are 3 of these on each triglyceride, right? So when you have the glycerol with 3 of these saturated fatty acids, it's going to look like this, okay? An unsaturated fatty acid, if you look at it, it's made of all of the same things, right? It's got your carbon, 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 carbon. The only difference is if you look here, you see that these carbons here, instead of attaching or bonding to hydrogen, to 2 hydrogens, they've bonded to 1 hydrogen and then bonded to each other twice. So it's a double bond. And that double bond, don't worry, you don't need to really understand this, but that double bond is what creates a kind of bend in the chain, okay? So when we talk about saturated, it's the fatty acid, triglyceride with 3 fatty acids that are straight. There's no bend in the fatty acid chain. When we talk about unsaturated, there are bends in the fatty acid chains, and they're different bends depending on where and how the molecules are attached and whatever. Don't worry about that. And here you've got, so unsaturated, a monounsaturated means mono meaning 1. Only 1 of the fatty acid chains is unsaturated. The other 2 are saturated. And then polyunsaturated, which is poly always means many, is more than 1. So either 3 bends, 2 bends, what have you. Why does that matter? Right? The reason it matters is because these triglycerides also make up part of your cell membrane. Okay, so if you look down at this kind of drawing I made here, if you look at the saturated side, the saturated fatty acids, if this is your cell membrane right here, and all of the triglycerides that are forming kind of their part of the cellular membrane are saturated, they're tightly packed together. See how these are tightly packed together. There aren't any spaces. If it's unsaturated, this kind of leg kicked up here, or maybe 2 legs here, or what have you, creates more space and more fluidity in that cellular membrane, so that things that need to move in and out can move in and out. And that right there is why unsaturated fats are healthier than saturated fats. So all of that, first of all, was to explain one slide. But the reason it's important is so that you really, when it comes down to it, if you're asked a question about what's better for you, unsaturated or saturated fat, it's not something you have to memorize. It's something that just makes sense now, because we know that when saturated means, all those fatty acid chains are straight and compact, it's going to create a cellular membrane that isn't fluid. Whereas unsaturated is going to do the opposite. So whether or not you understand how, the molecular structure of a fatty acid works, or the molecular structure of a triglyceride works, isn't really the issue. For nursing and for your exam, really just understanding really which is good and which is bad, and kind of having an idea of why, and kind of having an idea, being able to look at this kind of a chart and logically break it down, knowing that the body creates cholesterol, what it's for, how it travels through the blood, right? Understanding what triglycerides are for, that they're for energy, that we use them we store energy, but that they also can make up parts of the cellular wall. And then we don't want that cellular wall to be so compact that nothing can get through it. Okay, so out of all of that, really the take home is dyslipidemia is bad. We especially do not want high levels of low density lipoproteins or very low density lipoproteins, because those will not be able to make it back to the liver without their high density lipoproteins. And the reason we don't want them to build up is if they build up, they're going to be available when that damaged epithelium releases the free radicals, and when they're available, they're going to be oxidized by those free radicals, and they're going to turn into foam cells. Okay, that is really the takeaway. That is what's really, really important. Again, memorize these numbers, make sure you know them. How do we find these things out? First of all, we screen. Basically, any men over 40 and women over 50, even if they're not, like, have no family history or whatever, are screened for dyslipidemia. Any postmenopausal women are screened for dyslipidemia, and that's because of the relationship between estrogen and heart function, right? And then, or clotting, and then South Asian and First Nations or Indigenous Canadian descent are at a higher risk. So those people might want to be screened a little bit younger. These are numbers that, yeah, you pretty much just have to memorize. But it kind of makes sense when you understand the pathogenesis, right? We're not so worried about, a 20-year-old who's still at this stage here. But we are going to start to worry when a person is at, in their 40s or 50s, and they're at this stage here, and they're at much higher risk, right? We want to start screening then. Again, anybody who is a smoker, has diabetes or hypertension are high risk. So we're going to screen them, whether or not they're 40 or 50, like whether or not they're at, these high risk ages. Again, a family history of vascular disease or hyperlipidemia, CKD, erectile dysfunction, inflammatory disease. We've talked about how the inflammatory process affects HIV. So these things are important for sure. I would say your highlights, the things that you need to really, really remember in terms of risks and screening, would be smoking, diabetes, hypertension, family history, of course, dyslipidemia, and then really obesity. Those are really your high risk patients. And how do we kind of break that down? They use phenotyping, which for the purposes of your exam, all you really need to know is that it's blood work, and it's a way we take blood and then classify patients based on like the characteristics of their dyslipidemia. So you do not need to memorize this. You just need to understand that there are different classifications of dyslipidemia, and it depends on what's affected and what isn't, right? And so, if you look at 2B, for example, it would be your low density and very low density lipoproteins that are elevated. Your overall cholesterol is going to be higher than 7.8, and your triglycerides are going to be equal to or about 1.7. So each of these kind of areas stages are different, and they're classified based on that. I don't want to stress enough that you don't need to memorize this. Just understand, like, that's what phenotyping is. It's classifying based on the different levels and how they compare, right? And then again, we want to do this profile, this complete lipid profile, which is what gives us these results. We want to do that testing every 5 years, beginning at age 20. That was a very specific in the, I think it was a Lewis Heitkemper text. So just kind of keep this in mind. These people aren't necessarily at high risk. The reason we begin at age 20 is because we know that's when atherosclerosis kind of already starts or has been starting, but we're not going to see like, effects of it until they're here. This is what puts them at a high risk. This is just, average risk. Let's just do this to screen. But these people, these men over 40, women over 50, and all of these kind of things that I highlighted, these are high risk people that we screen no matter what. Okay, so I think that's it for talking about lipids and dyslipidemia. Really, really important. It's really like the #1 risk factor, or at least very, very high up there with hypertension, diabetes, and smoking. So in the next video, we'll go through a few of the other risk factors and talk about them and kind of go over what you may or may not be tested on, or what you should know.